Okay. I don't know what that problem was, but each piece of land would be used to grow wheat only once every 3 years. During the remaining 2 years, it would be used to grow barley, which did not make the same kind of demands on the land, and it would be allowed to lie fallow, which didn't make any demands on the land at all. So that was more productive because you get better crops. You're able to use each piece of land 2 years out of three. Whereas in the old system, if you had some of your land used to grow crops and some of it allowed to lie fallow, you would be using the land every other year, and that would kind of exhaust it more. So this is a system that they use to increase the productivity and quality of crops. Meanwhile, of course, these areas need to be protected. And one of the things you see in the medieval period, or the Middle Ages, or what we call the Dark Ages, is that it's not easy for the local lord to raise an army. Certainly not a big army, because one of the things that happens in this Middle Age period is that the idea of using coins, gold and silver coins, to pay people has died out. The currency has sort of gone out of the country to pay non-European countries for imported goods like silks and spices, things like that. And no coins are coming back into the kingdom because they haven't been able to come up with anything that will appeal to merchants who are going to China and India and places like that where they're able to grow their own crops. So there's no money to pay soldiers with. And if you don't have money to pay soldiers with, you have to figure out some other way of becoming the head of an army. And the one thing that the Europeans come up with in the Middle Ages is this idea of the so-called feudal system. The term is a complicated one. Back in the 19th century, people began to talk about feudalism as if it were one big system that really explained everything that was happening in the Middle Ages. I think that's overstating it. There are a lot of things that happened in the Middle Ages that you can't really connect with feudalism. But I think there was such a thing as the feudal system. And you can talk about that specifically in terms of its military usage. So I don't think it's wrong to talk about a feudal system, but you don't want to push the idea too far and try to force it to include things that it doesn't really include. The idea of a feudal system was that you had the lord, who was the lord of the manor and running his own little area and supervising the crops and things. You had another guy who was not poor, not a peasant, not somebody who would be out there working the fields, but a man who was not as powerful as the lord of the manor. And this person would go to the lord and swear his loyalty or his fealty to the lord of the manor. And it was something that was often done in the church. The vassal would kneel down in front of the lord and he would put his hands up and say, I promise to be. And then the lord would reach down and put his hands over the vassal's hand, and it would be a sacred oath. Later on in the period, in the development of the feudal system, some of these people were signing contracts, but it wasn't really a business relationship. It would be incorrect to describe it as sort of a employer-employee relationship. The vassal was a person of a certain social standing in his own right, and would not have been he wouldn't have appreciated being classed along with the people who were working in the fields. He would have considered that to be a degradation. So the vassal was a person of a certain amount of social standing who affiliates himself with a lord and says to the lord, whenever you want to go to battle, whenever you need protection, I will be able to do that for you. And the lord, in turn, has a certain amount of responsibility for taking care of his vassal, particularly providing the vassal with the economic resources the vassal needs so that the vassal can be a soldier, can be a warrior for the lord. If you have to raise crops and support yourself by working on a farm, you don't have time to be a soldier. You don't have time to do the kind of training that is required to learn how to ride a horse and to fight with a sword and things like that. So the lord has the responsibility to provide, or at least there is the expectation, let's say, that the Lord will provide the vassal with some kind of economic resources. Sometimes it's just a matter of the Lord allowing the vassal to live in the Lord's house, the Lord's castle. If you see any of these old movies that they used to make about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, or Ivanhoe or something like that, there are often scenes where the Lord is sitting at the head of the table, and then these knights are all sitting around the edge of the table, and they're all chowing down on whatever it is that medieval knights eat. And this is not because the Lord is throwing a party or anything like that. It's because the vassals are living in the castle. The vassals are in the castle in order to have the economic wherewithal to practice being knights, to practice their warrior skills. But sometimes the knight wanted to be more independent than that. He didn't want to have to live in somebody else's house. And so the Lord takes part of his own land, the Lord's land, and gives it on long-term loan to the vassal, not as a permanent possession. And it's important to stress that this, when the Lord gives the land to the vassal, it's not a payment for services. The Lord is providing to the vassal economic resources that the vassal can live on while the vassal is training to be a soldier and serve the Lord. Theoretically, this land could be taken away again if the vassal did not come up with his part of the oath. If the vassal rebelled against the Lord or refused to fight for the Lord, the land was still really belonging to the Lord. The ownership had not been transferred to the vassal. But the idea was that the loan could extend actually for generations. When the vassal died, the vassal's son, for instance, might perform a similar oath of fealty to the Lord and continue to serve the Lord as a military retainer, and in return would be allowed to use the land. Now, the land was called a fief. As I say, it was not a payment for services. In French, the word fief, the French word for fief is feu, which is actually the word for fire, and it gives you something of an idea of what the purpose of the fief was. It was to provide the home of the vassal with a place to, resources, like a fire on the hearth that you could cook your meals over. So the feu was, or the fief was an economic support that the Lord would loan to the vassal on long-term loan. And because the French word for fief is feu, we refer to the feudal system or feudalism. This was a way that lords could accumulate not necessarily very large armies, but large enough armies that they could defend themselves from things like invasions. From about 850 CE onward, the Europeans were having a lot of trouble with Viking invasions. Who were the Vikings? Well, the Vikings had originally started in Scandinavia, up north, where Norway and Sweden are, and that's why they were originally called Norsemen. Northmen becomes Norsemen. We sometimes refer to Norse culture when we're talking about the Scandinavian countries. The Norsemen become the Normans. From 850 on through the 900s, the Normans are very fierce warriors, but then they eventually settle down in northern France, which is an area that comes to be called Normandy after the Normans. And when the Allies in World War II invade France from the north across the English Channel, this is sometimes referred to as the Normandy invasion, because the English come down into this area that had been settled centuries before by the Norman invaders. Also, we have William the Conqueror, who we'll be talking about in a lecture or two later, who is also sometimes referred to as William of Normandy, and that's why his invasion of England is called the Norman invasion. So These Vikings are very troublesome people. They are coming into Europe and taking whatever they can lay their hands on. And one of the things that happens is that they attack a lot of the monasteries because the priests are not prepared to defend themselves. The priests are not supposed to be going around killing people. They're supposed to be praying and things like that. So the Vikings go into the monasteries and kill a lot of the monks and take all the valuable stuff that had been kept in the chapel of the monastery. This is a big problem. Everybody's very scared of the Vikings. So one of the things that happens is, and we haven't talked about England a lot lately so far in this course, but I did mention that the Anglo-Saxons were a group that came up from Germany across the North Sea and into what we consider today to be the British Isles. That there was no one single centralized government operating in England at this point. But in response to the Viking invasions, you have this guy, Alfred the Great of England. And he is actually not the king of England. There is no England when Alfred the Great starts out as a nation, but there are local kingdoms, and one of them is a kingdom called Wessex. Alfred is the king of Wessex, and he gets together the heads of all of the other little tribes and kingdoms around England and organizes them in order to defend England from the Vikings. And in that sense, you can compare him to Charlemagne, I note here, because he is one of these people during the Dark Ages, during the period when there was no revival of a strong centralized government in Western Europe, who nevertheless is able to bring a lot of the smaller, more localized areas together into a larger area. Alfred gets control of the invading Vikings, partly by fighting them and partly by buying them off. But he does create a peaceful situation in England again. Also, Alfred is important in the history of English culture because one of his programs is to translate a lot of the important religious documents at the time, parts of the Bible and things like that, into the language that the Anglo-Saxons people speak. He says, you should be able to not necessarily read for yourself, but when somebody is reading to you the Christian writings, you should be able to understand what they're saying. So he sometimes, some of the translations he does himself, some of them he hires other people to do. But these documents, which are translations into Anglo-Saxon, are the first written documents we have that are written in an ancestor of the English language. It's called Old English today. And after Alfred stops doing that, after he dies, there's a gap where nobody's writing things down. And then when people start writing things down in the area that today we call English, things like, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and things like that, that period is called Middle English. But the reason we have anything written down in Old English is because of Alfred's cultural attempts to stimulate people to read and write in their own language. Alfred's grandson Edgar is able to pull all these people together into a larger kingdom by proposing that the King of England is the Lord of all lords. This can be connected with a phenomenon that historians refer to as sub-enfeoffment. The idea, as I said, is that there would be a lord and a vassal. In this case, it would be the king. But the vassal could also be the lord of other vassals. You have this kind of hierarchical situation where everybody in England would be under the control of somebody, but it would be a local person who would then be under the control of another person who had jurisdiction over a larger area. So we don't really have what would eventually be known as the system of having a state, a government which is recognized in the abstract as having control over a large area. We still have face-to-face relationships. The Lord knows all of his vassals personally, And then the lord who has that lord as a vassal knows all of his vassals personally. You don't yet have any situation where people feel that they are citizens of a nation apart from the idea of being under the control and supervision of somebody they actually know by sight. That's going to be coming on later on down. But in this pre-modern period, you begin to have organization over a larger area than just the manor by the determination that a lord can be a vassal of somebody else. And then there will be at the top the lord of all lords, who is the king over all of the important guys and all of the less important guys who are vassals to the more important guys. So we'll pick this up later. Thank you.